This assignment required you to contrast the principles of equity theory with those expressed by a former vice president of Netflix in a podcast titled, "Hard Work is Irrelevant." The first question in the exercise is, based on the textbook, how are inputs and outcomes defined in equity theory? Inputs are defined as the training, effort, skills, and abilities that employees bring to or invest in their work. These include such things as the effort they put into their job, the loyalty they give to the company, their hard work, commitment, and so forth. Outcomes are defined as the compensation, satisfaction, and other benefits employees derive from the work. And they include such things as pay and salary they receive, their benefits, the recognition, reputation for working for the company, sense of achievement, and so forth. The second question in the exercise is, what is the difference between outputs, as discussed in the podcast, and outcomes, as defined by equity theory? In the podcast, outputs are what the company obtains for the employee's efforts. For example, one of the presenters in the podcast said, "In other words, we don't really care how hard you work, how much effort you put in. We only care about results. We care about your output, not your input." In equity theory, outcomes are what the employee obtains for his or her efforts. As mentioned in the previous slide, outcomes, compensation, satisfaction, and other benefits employees derive from their work. The third question of the assignment is, the podcast proposes that employees should be rewarded for their outputs regardless of their inputs. Is this consistent with equity theory? Explain. Let's review equity theory before we answer question 3. Equity theory attempts to explain how an employee's perception of inputs and outcomes affect his or her motivation. For example, if an employee receives 10 units of outcome for 10 units of input, then the ratio of outcomes to inputs is 1, and there's a state of equity. In other words, there's a fair exchange for what the employee puts into his or her job and what the company provides to the employee. However, if an employee provides 20 units of inputs but receives only 10 units of outcome in return, there is a state of inequity. The employee is likely to feel under-rewarded. In order to reduce the tension this inequity causes and to achieve a more equitable state, an employee may engage in counterproductive behaviors in order to balance the scales, such as increasing absenteeism, not showing up to work for some days, increased tardiness, being late for work, reducing the amount of effort they put into their job. If they feel that they're underpaid or under-rewarded, they may lower their effort in their job to make that feel more comfortable for them. Or they may engage in theft. If they feel that they're giving more to the company gives them the return, they can make that a more equitable situation by making up the difference in things they steal from the company. And inequity can also exist when outcomes exceed inputs. That is, when an employee receives more from the company than he or she contributes to the company. A typical example is when an employee is overpaid for the work he or she performs. According to equity theory, this also causes tension and predicts that an employee will engage in behaviors that bring the outcome to input ratio closer to 1. For an example, an employee who feels over-rewarded might work longer hours to justify their excessive pay, or work harder and increase their effort, may contribute more time to the company that's required, may engage in positive behaviors for the company about praising the company to others or saying good things about it. But the point being here is when an employee perceives there's not a state of equity, that causes kind of a psychological or emotional tension within the employee, and they are going to act in order to achieve that more equitable state. And it can happen when an employee feels under-rewarded, but the theory would also predict that the same thing would happen if the employee feels over-rewarded. Equity theory also predicts that an employee's motivation is moderated by the perceived equity between the employee's ratio of outcomes to inputs compared to that of other employees. When the ratios are equal, then a state of equity exists. When they are unequal, then tension increases and employees will engage in behaviors in order to achieve an equitable state and thus reduce the tension. For example, equity theory would predict that if you perceived your ratio of outcomes to inputs was less than a coworker's ratio, then you're likely to experience such negative emotional states as being jealous of the employee, feeling that you're being treated unfairly, must be favoritism going on in the organization, likely to feel demotivated. So in order to create a more equitable state, you may sabotage this other individual's work, refuse to cooperate or collaborate with that individual. One way to reduce tension and achieve a more perceived equitable state is to rationalize the situation. For example, you might try to convince yourself that the coworker is a better worker and deserves greater rewards. Or you might assume that there must be something that you do not know that justifies the coworker's relatively higher outcomes to input ratio. The theory would also predict that the coworker would strive to achieve equity if he or she perceives the same inequity that you do. For example, the coworker may feel guilty that he or she is, perception is both putting in the same amount of work, but the coworker is receiving greater outcomes, may feel guilty about this. And in order to achieve a more equitable state, the coworker may try to help you out, give you advice, help you in ways so that you're receiving the same outcomes that they are, or maybe helping you work smarter so you don't have to work as hard or put in as many inputs as the coworker does in order to receive the same amount of income or outcomes. And if the roles were reversed, you'd be the one feeling guilty and trying to help the coworker. Let's return to question 3. The podcast proposes that employees should be rewarded for their outputs regardless of their inputs. In other words, rewards, or outcomes is a term used in equity theory, should be based on results regardless of inputs such as the time, effort, or ingenuity required to produce the results. For example, in most classes, your exam grades are based on results, typically the number of correct answers, not your inputs, not the hours you studied, the sacrifices you made to study or to attend classes. Does it seem fair when you had to study 5 hours to pass an exam when another student received the same grade with only 2 hours of study? Is it fair that you aced the final and had perfect class attendance while another student who rarely came to class also aced the final? So getting back to the exercise question, is the practice of rewarding employees for outputs or results, regardless of their inputs, consistent with equity theory? I would suggest the answer is no. According to equity theory, motivation is linked directly to an employee's perceived ratio of outputs to inputs. That's inputs should not be ignored. We talk about examples of inequity employees perceive between the amount of inputs, amount of effort, what they put in to achieve results at the organization compared to what the organization is providing to them. And when that inequity exists, they're counterproductive and negative behaviors are likely to occur, such as increases in absenteeism and theft and so forth. And also when employees compare their outcomes and inputs to other employees, if there's perceived inequities, there's also destructive and counterproductive behaviors that are likely to occur. So I think it's naive for an organization to ignore the motivational influence that the perceived ratios of outcomes to inputs have on employees.